The most respected woman in my old church was, by every measure the congregation used, a model of Christian character. And she was also, by her own quiet admission years later, one of the most spiritually numb people in the building every single Sunday. Nobody suspected it. That's the part worth sitting with before you read anything else. The sins that quietly rot a faith rarely look like sin at all. They look like normal. They look like everyone else. They look, most dangerously, like virtue. Her name was Patricia, and she told me her story over coffee long after she'd left that church, in the plain, unhurried voice of someone who has finally stopped defending her old self. She wasn't confessing scandal. There was no affair, no theft, no public failure. What she was confessing was smaller and, in its own way, more unsettling. A list of ordinary behaviors she'd practiced for 2 decades inside the church walls. Behaviors everyone around her practiced too. Behaviors nobody ever called sin because they'd all silently agreed, without ever saying so, that these things didn't count. The first was gossip wearing the costume of concern. Patricia led a women's prayer group for 12 years, and every week, without fail, someone's name came up so we can lift her up in prayer, followed by details that had nothing to do with intercession and everything to do with information nobody had permission to share. A friend's struggling marriage, a teenager's rebellion, a husband's job loss described with just enough sympathetic head tilting to make the sharing feel holy. Patricia knew, somewhere underneath the practiced language, that this wasn't prayer. It was theater with a spiritual alibi. Scripture doesn't soften its language here. A gossip separates close friends, Proverbs says plainly. But Patricia had never once heard the word gossip used inside that circle. They called it sharing burdens. It took her years to notice that the burden always seemed to grow heavier with an audience, and lighter the moment it was actually prayed for in private, which almost never happened. The second was the fear of man dressed up as wisdom. Patricia was, by nature, a peacekeeper, and for most of her adult life, she called this a gift. It took her a painful season to recognize that half of what she called peacekeeping was simple cowardice. Agreeing with whoever was in the room, softening every honest opinion until it offended no one. Staying silent when a friend made a decision Patricia knew was destructive, because speaking up might cost her the relationship. I told myself I was being gentle, she said. I wasn't being gentle. I was being afraid. And I'd found a spiritual word to cover the fear. The book of Proverbs calls the fear of man a snare. And Patricia came to understand that a snare doesn't feel like danger while you're standing in it. It feels like accommodation. It feels, until the trap closes, like being easy to get along with. The third was bitterness Patricia had convinced herself was simply memory. A woman in her small group had wronged her years earlier. Nothing dramatic, just a betrayal of confidence during a hard season. And Patricia had, by her own account, forgiven her in the way people mean when they stop bringing something up out loud, while still keeping a precise internal ledger of it. She could recite the offense in detail a decade later. She still flinched, faintly, every time the woman's name came up in conversation. Unforgiveness rarely announces itself as hatred. It usually just looks like a very good memory attached to a very cold heart. And because Patricia never raised her voice about it, never told anyone she was still carrying it, she'd assumed for years that it had simply stopped mattering. It hadn't stopped mattering. It had only stopped being visible, which is a different thing entirely, and arguably more dangerous. The fourth was comfort worship disguised as gratitude for blessing. This one, Patricia said, was the hardest to see because everyone around her practiced it fluently, herself included. New house, upgraded car, a bigger vacation than last year's. Every acquisition got baptized in the language of blessing, thanked publicly from the front of small group meetings, treated as evidence of God's favor, rather than simply as things a comfortable family could afford. Nobody in that circle would have called themselves materialistic. They called it stewardship, called it gratitude, called it enjoying what God provided. But Patricia noticed, slowly, that the language of blessing was reserved almost exclusively for accumulation, never for loss, and that the people in the room with the least were somehow never asked to share what God had blessed them with that week. Christ's warning about serving both God and money doesn't disappear just because everyone agrees to describe the money as a gift. The fifth was pride that had learned cleverly to speak in the first-person plural. Patricia had watched and participated in countless conversations where leaders in the church described their accomplishments as what God did through us. A phrase that sounds humble and functions, more often than anyone wanted to admit, as a way of taking credit while sounding like you're deflecting it. She remembered standing at the front of a fundraising dinner once, describing a ministry initiative she'd led, using that exact phrase 4 times in one speech, and feeling, underneath the pious wording, a very ordinary and very human hunger to be seen as the one who'd made it happen. It's a genius disguise, she told me. You get to be proud and humble at the same time, as long as you remember to mention God's name before anyone notices. The sixth was grumbling that everyone agreed to call venting. Patricia's small group had an unspoken tradition of opening every meeting with what they called just getting it off our chests. Complaints about spouses, about jobs, about the pastor's latest sermon series, about each other, delivered with a kind of casual permission that made it feel harmless. Paul's instruction to the Philippians to do everything without grumbling or arguing got quoted often in that church, usually aimed at teenagers or new believers. Never once at the room full of grown women who'd built an entire ritual around a practice with the same name Scripture explicitly warned against. Grumbling, Patricia came to see, isn't dangerous because complaints are always false. It's dangerous because it trains the heart to default to what's wrong before it notices what's true. And a heart trained that way for 20 years doesn't easily remember how to do the opposite. The seventh was judgment worn as discernment. This was the one Patricia was slowest to confess, because it implicated the very posture she'd used to survey everyone else's failings for the first 6 items on this list. She had spent years being the woman other women brought their concerns to, the one whose opinion carried weight precisely because she seemed so spiritually clear-eyed about other people's blind spots. What she hadn't examined, until much later, was how rarely that same clear-eyed scrutiny turned inward. She could spot a friend's materialism in a sentence. It took her a decade to spot her own. Christ's warning about the plank and the speck isn't really a warning against noticing sin in others. It's a warning about the order of operations, about examining the log in your own eye first. And Patricia realized, with real grief, that she had spent years skipping that first step entirely, mistaking her fluency in naming other people's sin for evidence that her own eyes were clean. None of this came to Patricia all at once. It came slowly, mostly during a season when her own life fell apart in ways too ordinary to make a dramatic story. A health scare, a grown child who stopped speaking to her, a long stretch of nights too anxious for sleep. And in that unraveling, stripped of the busyness that had always made her feel productive and holy, she finally had the stillness to look honestly at the shape her faith had actually taken over 20 years. What she found wasn't unbelief. It was something quieter and harder to name. A faith that had learned to call its own compromises by kinder words, and had gotten so good at the relabeling that it no longer noticed the substitution happening. She left that church eventually, not out of bitterness, but out of a need to rebuild something more honest. And she told me the hardest part of the rebuilding wasn't repenting of any single behavior on that list. It was retraining herself to notice the moment a sin was about to get renamed, to catch the word sharing before it covered gossip, the word peacekeeping before it covered fear, the word blessed before it covered greed, and to simply call the thing what it was, out loud, to herself, before her own vocabulary had the chance to soften it. That's the whole discipline, she said. Not becoming perfect, just refusing to let yourself lie about what something actually is. I think about Patricia's list more often than I expected to when she first told it to me. Mostly because none of the 7 things she named required a single dramatic decision to fall into. They required only 20 years of familiarity. 20 years of everyone around her using the same soft words for the same hard things, until the words themselves became the hiding place. Sin rarely walks into an ordinary life wearing a warning label. It walks in wearing whatever your community has already agreed to call acceptable, and it stays exactly as long as no one is willing to call it by its real name. Call the thing what it actually is. That's the whole of it. Not a harsher heart, just a more honest one.